This is Eric Jansen of iTulip.com, and today I'm going to show you in a single chart why the economy still feels so bad even though it's not in recession anymore, and how this recovery is different from any other recovery on record. First, let me orient you on this chart. This chart shows the difference between real versus potential GDP from 1929 until the year 2020. So on the bottom scale we have the dates from 1929 until 2020, and on the left hand scale we have GDP in billions of inflation adjusted dollars up to 20 trillion. The blue line is real potential GDP, and again the concept of potential GDP relates to the idea that an economy has a tendency to grow at a pretty constant rate over very long periods of time. The U.S. economy has grown at a 3.23% annual rate over the last 82 years. The red line is the actual GDP growth, so how much it has actually grown over that period of time. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of variability between the potential and actual economic performance. One of the problems with depicting the data in this way, in a linear fashion, is that there's been a great deal of inflation since this period of time, and also economic growth. So this is distorting our chart. It's making the current output gap and recession look much larger than the Great Depression, which of course isn't true. So what we're going to do is switch over to a chart that's on a log scale, and again you see GDP here in billions of chain dollars, from 500 billion to 18 trillion. But again, it's on a log scale. The data are more accurately represented by the chart. Okay, now we can actually see the relative difference between the current economic crisis and the Great Depression and other recessions and recoveries that we've had since 1929. So we can start by looking at the Great Depression itself, which began with a recession, very large recession, actually producing negative 25% of GDP decline. By 1933, it had produced an output gap of approximately 30%, actually 27% of GDP. And this gap, again, the output gap, is a difference between real and potential GDP. It's this difference here. And that lasted from 1933 all the way until 1940. So the recession is this period of time here from 1930 to 1933, and the output gap is from 1933 until 1940. Together, these are the Great Depression, this 10-year period of recession plus the output gap. Now, a couple other features of the Great Depression here. You'll notice that there is a second recession inside of the Great Depression after the initial recession that produced the output gap. The reason for this was a combination of things. There was an election in 1936. The Republican platform was very similar to today. The New Deal programs had produced a large increase in federal government debt, $11 billion, which at the time was more or less equivalent to the $11 trillion in increase in spending under the Obama administration. There was a lot of concern about how this was going to affect the country's credit rating going forward. The other reason was for this recession. So what happened was that even though the Democrats won and FDR won a second term, the Congress was overwhelmingly Democratic in control, they stopped fiscal stimulus and closed the budget deficit from negative 4% of GDP to zero. That, in combination with some moves by the Treasury Department that were restrictive to monetary policy, produced the second recession. Then those policies were reversed. The Treasury Department switched gears, and the fiscal stimulus was reapplied. The deficit was grown again to negative 2% of GDP, but it's not clear what would have happened after that because along came World War II. And as you can see, World War II produced a gigantic surplus in the difference between potential GDP and actual GDP growth. So after the war, all this entire period up until the 1980s, you can see that the difference between actual and potential GDP was pretty close. It ranged to about -3 to positive 6% of GDP within a fairly narrow range of potential. Not until 1980, the early 1980s, there was a series of 2 recessions produced by monetary policy in order to choke off a inflation spiral. Not until then had we seen a recession as large as the one that we saw in 2008 to 2010. The recession that was produced by monetary policy in the early 1980s closed in 1 year. It closed by 1984. However, as you can see, the output gap that was opened up by the so-called Great Recession is still where it was. It opened to about 7.7% of GDP, and today, 3 years later, it's still at 7.5% of GDP. The unusual feature of this recession is that the output gap is not closing. This chart shows what a persistent output gap means to the average person. What we have here is a chart that shows the average duration of unemployment, that is, the number of weeks that the average unemployed person has spent out of work. Worst case before the current depression were the recessions of the early 1980s. Even then, when the average duration of unemployment peaked at 20 weeks, it peaked immediately after the recession and then began to decline. This time, the average duration of unemployment peaked at twice that level, at 40 weeks, and it continued to rise for a year after the recession, and as of 2012, has still not declined. This is an extraordinarily bad performance for a labor market. So here's the problem in summary. Even the major recessions that we had, like in the early 1980s, the output gap closed quickly within 1 year. Here we had an equally large recession, 2008-2009, but 3 years later, output gap has not closed at all. The problem is the growth rate. The potential growth rate, as I mentioned before, is about 3.23%. The problem is that the economy shrank, and now it's been growing ever since then at about 2%. At this rate, the gap will never close, and what will happen, the economy will feel worse and worse and worse. This also leaves us vulnerable to an external shock, such as something coming out of Europe or out of China or out of the Middle East, that will send our economy back into recession and open the output gap even further and make it even more difficult for our economy to recover. If I were the Romney campaign, I would be putting this image of the output gap in front of everyone so that they can see that the current policies aren't working. The Romney campaign needs to clearly explain how they're going to get 4% GDP growth for the next 5 or 6 years. If they can do that, then they earn everyone's vote.